Let's begin with a word of prayer. Lord, please grant us the blessing of your Spirit as we study your word. In Christ's name we pray. Amen. Okay, so I have a study that I'm working on. I will be taking most of the month of January. So I have a study that I've been considering, but I haven't finished it yet. So in the interim, what we'll do today is we'll just do a review, an overview of the some of the things Elder Parminder shared in his New Year's Day message, his New Year's Eve messages. There were two presentations. One was called "They Cannot Be Made Perfect Without Us," and the second one was called "Many Are Called, but Few Are Found Worthy." So a lot of important clarifications were shared in this study, and in the way that clarifications often happen, which is pointing us back to the lines, pointing us back to models that have already been shared, concepts that have already been shared, because the reality is we tend to forget, right? And he was answering questions that I've been aware of and questions that I've even had over the course of the last few months that I've been considering, grappling with. But again, the way the answer was to simply, point us back to what has already been shared, because the answers are there in a closer consideration of the lines. So, and again, it's not a lecture. I invite your thoughts and participation and questions, and I think I'll have some questions of my own to pose to you along the way as we go, right? So, and I would encourage you to open your mic and speak as opposed to the chat, because I don't have ready visibility of the chat when I'm looking at my notes. So I may not get to your question or point in good time. So, Elder Parminder began by addressing the point of our relationship with the Levites. And this is a point that he had addressed previously in September last year at it was the international camp meeting in September last year. And the point he was making was that we have misconstrued what the harvest looks like. Right, we're in the time period of the harvest of the Levites. I think that we all understand, but we have misconstrued what the harvest looks like. In the spirit of Sabbath school, can I ask someone to elaborate? What was he saying? How have we misconstrued what the harvest of the Levites looks like? Does anyone have any thoughts as to at least what they understood he was saying?
We held to our Adventist concept of a Pentecost-like gathering in of Levites, that many would come, and he let us know that isn't the way it's going to be.
Exactly, right. We've had this upper room, Pentecostal vision of what the harvest of the Levites is going to look like. And the way he expressed it was, we have taken it literally. And although our modeling is correct, right? We're absolutely correct that we presently stand in the harvest of the Levites, and this is the time period in which that work is happening. But in how we conceptualize what it looks like, we've fallen into that trap that we keep falling into, that we've fallen into many a time over the history of this movement, that we've had to unlearn in many different ways. The trap of viewing things literally, right? So although we are correct in our modeling, in our identification that we are where we are, and what the model says is to be happening now is the work that is happening now. What it looks like, it doesn't look like what we've envisioned it to look like. So I took a short quotation where I quoted him almost verbatim from my notes to his presentation, his first presentation called Life or Death Message that he gave in September. He says, the question is, why are the Levites not joining us? I do not have the answer, but what I am certain about is there isn't a negative reason. By negative reason, it's, when people say, well, why isn't something that we believe should happen, why isn't it happening? We tend to have go-to lines of thinking that, well, we're Laodicean, or we're not doing our jobs, type of thing. So what he's saying is there isn't a negative reason. If this is the case, then what is being shown to us is that we must have a misunderstanding of the application. The Bible says spiritual things are spiritually discerned, and we are all familiar with the simple rule of local literal, worldwide spiritual. And we are all familiar with we now live in a dispensation where things need to be understood spiritually. What I believe has happened is we have taken many aspects of scripture spiritually, but we have held on to baggage, which is the tendency to view things literally. The structures are correct, but the applications are not necessarily so because we've taken them literally. And when we do that, we can come to the wrong conclusions and become disappointed. And later on, it says, our understanding of harvest in the lines of the priests and Levites has been misunderstood. Therefore, we are misunderstanding the harvest of the Nethinim. So we ought to pay attention to what is happening in the world, because it will not go as we expect. So I said, he was saying that we're viewing the harvest too literally in our expectation of a large gathering. And but what has followed in terms of what people have deduced or concluded from what he shared, right? Because from his perspective, he says that what he shared is that it has triggered or created a lot of rumbling, a lot of discontent, a lot of worry and concern about the direction that the movement is taking. And that worry and concern is based on the conclusions that people have been drawing from what he shared. Well, maybe it's a worthwhile question to ask in here. What have you understood? What did you understand from what he shared? What did you conclude or extrapolate from what he shared in September? Because the issue was, what the harvest looks like and our relationship with the Levites, right? What did you deduce? Any thoughts? Any thoughts, anyone?
Basically, kind of like what Debbie was saying, like the Jews of old, we have our own ideas of what the harvest should look like, and it's not going to follow that pattern that we previously assumed it would. And this wasn't a reason to panic, because we just need to understand more clearly the application, as you're saying.
Okay, so you weren't troubled at all by what he shared in September?
Also, that we have individual responsibility. There'll be more one-on-one as opposed to, you know, the large group evangelism kind of setting, and which brought us down to some of what he shared December 31st.
Sounds good. Does anyone else have any? Was anyone troubled? Is anyone among those that were disturbed by this information?
I think for myself, I don't know if I'm out of topic, but please, just the last presentation that he did, and he referred to the one that he talked about. And he talked about just as it was in the days of Noah. And he asked the question, who did Noah save into the ark? And the answer was no one. And I was so quick to say his children, his family. But I'm like, that's him. He comprises of his family. That's the grace of God. Expected that will be saved in our household. But now, who did he convert? Preaching 120 years, and the fact that the people who make it into the kingdom of heaven it's such a small group. And it got me worried thinking about my church family here, my family, and I'm looking at all of them, and I'm like, nobody's going to heaven? Like, seriously. And that now resonated with me more, because now what he was talking about is that we ourselves at this particular have to be working out ourselves. We have to be fearing for ourselves if we're going to make it. So yeah, it did get me worried.
Okay, well, okay. The issue, what you're discussing, what you're addressing, we're going to come to that. Okay, but essentially, people understood from what you were sharing that, you know, our work for the Levites, what is the value of our work for the Levites then? Right? Is it futile? You know, individually speaking, is working for the Levites futile? You know, if what are we to be doing? Right. So that's a question that emerged from that. Some suggested that maybe the Levites saved themselves, and it's easy to see how someone may come to that conclusion if you reason, well, when you look at the two streams. The Levites are developed externally from ourselves, so maybe they are harvested in the same way, right? But that is a misunderstanding, right? So in his last two presentations on New Year's Eve, he is addressing these misunderstandings and clarifying, you know, our relationship to the Levites and what our role is in this time period. But in contextualizing our current position, in contextualizing what is happening in relation to this question, he referred back to a former history, the movement's former history. He referred back to 2014, right? I don't know, maybe some of us were not around in 2014. Of those who were, you know, maybe we don't remember it as those, you know, years ago now. But in 2014, you recall the light of Ezra 7:9 coming into prominence. And what followed in that time period, of course, it was preceded by you know, the beginnings of that shaking with the other major ministries in the movement over concepts like the Day of the Lord and so on and so forth. So that the shaking over the day of the Lord, the disagreement over that prophetic concept, and who the locusts are, who the insects are in Joel, in the book of Joel, the 4 insects and that prophetic vision and so on and so forth. That created the backdrop. It already created the backdrop of animosity and tension. So that, when Ezra 7:9 opened up, it's kind of like the battle lines had been drawn and people had already kind of prepared their hearts and minds to reject it. But Ezra 7:9 opened up, and what opened up in connection with it was the study of the covenant lines. The covenant lines. And the covenant lines presented this concept of no public evangelism, right? That now is a time for an exclusive internal work. And when we look at those covenant lines, just by way of recap quickly, it was looking at, say, look at the line of Christ, right? The beginning history of the Omega history of ancient Israel, that when God is entering into covenant with a people and divorcing another group of people, he calls those people into an exclusive internal work. Right. So you have here just laid out that, you have these 7 years, 25-20 days, 25-20 being a symbol of the covenant, taking you to 34 AD. And what was taking place in this time period was an exclusive internal work. Christ sent after his baptism and the gathering of the disciples, Christ did not send them to the Gentiles, he sent them to the Jews. Right, and this period allotted to the Jews is laid out in the book of Daniel as well. The last week of the 490-year period of Jewish probation. So, and there were other lines that he brought out, that Elder Jeff brought out, which laid out that 27 AD, of course, typifies 9/11 or 2001, I should say. It was 9/11 back then. Okay, and you have to. Right, so basically from 27 AD until what was understood then as 34 AD, it was presented as the Sunday law, were to be in a period of an exclusive internal work, no public evangelism, a work that is taking place among God's people. And I remember that time period that the leading ministries that separated over the day of the Lord, Joel and Ezra 7:9, this was one of their complaints, one of their gripes, shall we say, that Jeff is teaching that we're not to do evangelism, we're not to share the gospel, right? And the way it was opposed, the way they would challenge that was just take the book of evangelism and just read face value, proof text, just reading passages about how Ellen White is saying our final work in this time period is to take the gospel to the world, right? So even back then, people were confronted with the issue of methodology and whether you're going to, and the relationship of the lines to plain face value reading of scriptural passages, right? So now, among those who accepted who accepted the lines and the concept of the of no public evangelism, of the exclusive internal work, they made mistakes as well. People misunderstood this point and they went to extremes, suggesting that, I remember the discussions going on, people saying, are we not allowed to share our message with Adventists? So maybe we're not allowed to share our message with Adventists or people in the world. Say we're not allowed to share our message with people in the world. We're not allowed to, some extended that even also to Adventists, right? But what was the mistake? What's the issue there? What mistake are they making by deducing that from the concept of the exclusive internal work? Someone says, okay, so we're in a exclusive internal work from 2001. And then you say, so that means we're not allowed to share our message with the world, right? That's wrong. Why is that wrong? What is the mistake that person's making?
Please repeat it, Tipple, the question.
Or the question is, okay, so a lot of, even those who are on the right side of the issue in 2014 in relation to Ezra 7:9 and this concept of the exclusive internal work, they made mistakes as well. And one of the mistakes that was made was people started reasoning that, okay, so if we're in an exclusive internal work, that means we can't share our message. We're not allowed to talk to people in the world about it. And some extended that concept even to Adventists. I recall that, we're not allowed to share our message with Adventists either. And both those points are wrong. And I'm asking, why are they wrong? What are they getting tripped up on?
Tawa, is it because like with the history that you put on the board, even in that history, you can see examples of individuals being exposed to the message that weren't part of the Jewish nation? I don't know, either that and also the fact that there's an organizational application and then the individual experience.
That's the point, right? That's the main point, that when we look at the prophetic lines, at what level are they speaking generally? They're not dealing with the individual level. They're dealing with organizations, right? They're dealing with bodies, right? So the concept was speaking to the organizational level, not what people did as individuals. So there had to be that clarification work done, to sort of say to people that, as a movement, we're not conducting organized evangelistic efforts to reach people in the world. But as an individual, right, that does not mean that, you don't share as and when you have opportunity to do so. It's dealing with the corporate level, the organizational level. So what's happened with this question of the work for the Levites, the identification that we have misconstrued what the harvest looks like, and there isn't this massive ingathering that we previously envisioned. In response to that, people have gotten on the same platform as they did in 2014, 8 years ago, and are asking the same questions and making the same mistakes. Right. Right. Because when you say, the mistake being, okay, so beginning to question the value, or whether you should be therefore engaging Levites on a personal level, right? To come to that assumption based on the identification that there isn't a massive ingathering. There's the Pentecostal ingathering that's not what the lines are presenting. To conclude from that, okay, well, maybe I shouldn't be putting forth efforts for the Levites, or maybe my personal efforts for the Levites are without value. That's making the same mistake that was made in 2014. It's conflating organizational with individual, right? So I hope we see that was the first point Elder Parminda made in his first study, when he sought to contextualize the current questions around the place of the Levites and our relationship with them right now.
Question.
Yes.
I recollect as well that back in time, more in the era of 2014, with the initial no public evangelism messages, but also later with the Midnight Cry messages, where we came to recognize we didn't have the right message. If we had gone to others, we would have, in a sense, steered them wrongly, because we didn't have all the message as it developed later, and we could have done more harm in a sense than good. Is that an aspect in here, Tebo, or am I
I
incorrect?
think certainly, and that's become even clearer in hindsight, because yes, then it was the response that was, we don't even have a clear message for the world anyway. We don't even have a neatly packaged. The message was still developing in our hands, right? And that development was necessary before we would be ready to take it to the world. But of course, now post Midnight Cry, that point comes into prospect in a whole new way, that we were completely off base, and we needed to receive the Midnight Cry, to be prepared to carry the message. The Midnight Cry is the message to carry to the world, and we need to receive it first. So that was an aspect, but it has come into clearer prospect now in hindsight, post Midnight Cry. Continuing on, Father Parminda went on to say people are making another mistake, and he went back to 2018 and 2019 when the Midnight Cry was opening up, to identify the second mistake that is presently being made. Right, 2018, 2019, when it was taught that about liberty and freedom, people misunderstood this study too, and they extrapolated it as well in ways that led to wrong conclusions. They construed that the world is better than the movement. The world understood freedom and equality before we put those concepts front and center. The world had an understanding of freedom and equality before we put those concepts front and center through the Midnight Cry. Therefore, they're ahead of us. Therefore, we need to go to them to learn the truth. So people forgot their Bibles, and they got to a place where they believed that they could get salvation for people who were themselves lost, right? Lost sinners. And this led to a wave in which many faithful people, left the movement. So you recall that those who were involved in that, I guess we'll call it in that era, they also discarded the reform message. They also discarded reform's health reform. right? All the reforms that we have and that are the reforms, presented in our vows, in our baptismal vows, because the thinking was that, well, the world doesn't have vows, and the world doesn't have reform, so we don't need it either, right? But Elder Parmenter went on to point that your hopes were all settled in the understanding of the validity of the vows and of the reforms and the protective nature of the reforms and the necessity of them for us as God's people. But in any case, people are making the same mistake in thinking that, well, the world must have it together. The Levites and Nethinim, they're not harvested by us, but they will still be saved. They will figure it out on their own, and God will teach them. Right? That's another line of thinking that has come through from the consideration of this point about our relationship with the Levites and what the harvest looks like. But again, that's incorrect, right? And the central question is, if the Levites are not joining the, sorry, I feel it was disjointed. Let me just round off that point, right? So you have these two mistakes being repeated, shall we say, that from 2014 of failing to clearly demarcate between organizational and individual levels, and that from 2018 to 2019 of sort of extrapolating that the world or those outside the movement will be taken care of, they're okay, right? And that we don't necessarily have a role in interfering with their trajectory, with their course, right? These are the two mistakes. But the central question at the heart of this issue is, if the Levites are not joining the movement, which they're not in the way that we envision, what does that mean for their salvation? Can they be saved outside of this movement? Right? And the answers to this question are found in a topic that he had presented in 2016, which is Matthew 13, the wheat and the tares, right? If the Levites are not joining the movement, what does that mean for their salvation? And can they be saved outside the movement? The answer, we go back to the lines, we go back to the information that we've already been given, because a lot of the time the answers to the questions we're struggling with now are there. They're in what has already been presented. We just need to look at it more closely. So I've not been very cognizant or aware that I knew that people were wrestling with it, asking questions, talking about it, but I did not see that it had created discontent, that a lot of people were upset and troubled about it. I've not had visibility of that, but he says that the amount of upset that his studies from last September, of course, are comparable to that which took place in 2016 over Matthew 13, the subject of the wheat and the tares, when he presented that. And incidentally, that's also where we find the answers to the questions that are troubling, that are apparently causing trouble at this juncture. So Matthew 13, the wheat and tares. When it comes to a group or a body, prophecy is clear. and it is easy to make conclusions at that level. But when you come down to the individual level, it becomes more difficult to ascertain what is happening, right? None of us have spyware to monitor each other 24/7 to know whether a person's a wheat or a tare, right? And the basis of the criteria of what distinguishes a wheat from a tare is the the acceptance of the message of equality, right? But it's not just an intellectual assent. It's not just an assent to the information, the baptismal vows. It is internalizing it in your own life, obeying it in your own life, right? Right, and for that, we just don't know. We just can't tell, really. The criteria by which wheat and tares are distinguished is by their fruit, okay? But you can get a good tare and a bad wheat, is what he says. You can get a good tare and a bad wheat, and you can't really distinguish the true nature of each really until the end, right? So at the individual level, it becomes unsafe. We shouldn't be drawing conclusions about people at that level. But when it comes to the organizational level, we find, we're able to see things more clearly. The field, when we look at the field in the parable, what does the field represent? Anyone?
This movement or the church or the world?
Okay, before we come to that, Jonathan has a question. Can you explain a good tare and a bad wheat? I'll put that to the floor. How would you explain that? It's something that he said in his presentation, why you can't really distinguish between the wheat and the tares on an individual level, because you can get a good tare and a bad wheat. Does someone care to elaborate on that? How do you understand that? How is that possible? Let's be students, share your thinking. No one wants to venture a thought?
Only when inside characteristics, character is demonstrated, is it distinguishable. And eventually it gets to a place where wheat behave like wheat and tares behave like tares. So I'm not sure if, at this point, it's not distinguishable who might be a good tare or a bad wheat. For the reason you said, no one is with somebody else 24/7 and spying on them. And it's only going to manifest as the heart gets demonstrated. What's in the heart gets demonstrated. And that's, as Jesus said, by their fruits ye shall know them. It's in in a sense, in the actions, but it will be as people are tested with the different issues, equality being the bigger umbrella issue, they will manifest whether they're a wheat or a tare. But it's not up to us at this point to be judging and determining who's a wheat, who's a tare. It'll come out later.
Yeah, thanks for that, David. Does anyone else have any thoughts? Jonathan, you open your mic. Were you going to share something?
I was always thinking that a tare was a bad or was a false priest and a wheat was a good priest. So I just having trouble wrangling this thought that you can be a good false priest or a bad good priest. It just seems like a double negative. So I don't get it.
I had the exact same question you had, and I was gonna ask him. I just didn't get time to before our study today. But maybe I'll share my thoughts as we towards the end of the study if it doesn't click along the way. All right, so let's come back to that. All right, so but good question though. I'd like us to clarify. So when we look at the field, on one level, it represents, I guess we'll say the world. But we know through our methodology, we can identify a number of levels at which it applies. On one level, it applies to the world. On one level, it applies, on another level, it applies to the church. And on an even more, say, a third level down, it applies to the priests. So when we look at and these three levels correspond essentially with, I'll put here this movement. These three levels correspond with our model of the priests, the Levites, and the Mtetwa. Now, when you come to the world, you identify the field. The field is the world. And in the world, there are wheat and tares. At this level, it's easy to see, or rather it's easy to deal with, because on one side, you have, we'll say the church. And then on the other side, you have those outside the church. I'll put outside church. And you have the wheat here and the tares here. And when you bring it down to this level, to the level of the church, it becomes easy to see again, because you have this movement as wheat, and you have let's say SDA, the Adventist Church, as the tares. But it's when you come to the movement level now, when you come to this movement, it gets problematic because you have all the priests right? You have all the priests are wheat and tares. And when it comes this close to home, people become prone to making judgments, prone to accusing each other. And this dynamic has had to be confronted in the time period since the study was presented. So if you do a study on the wheat and the tares, and you're looking at it at the movement level, you have to do it carefully to avoid falling into that pit. But applying this model at the level of the church, there is Adventism and there's this movement, right? Or rather, if we start, the proper way to do it is to begin at the macro level, model it at the macro level, and then use that template on the subsequent levels, right? So when you look at the world in the context of the harvest at the end of the world, is there salvation for those outside the church? At this level, the answer to that is no, right? When the Sunday law crisis comes, you're either in the church or outside it. You either have the seal of God or you don't. And there's no salvation for those outside the church, right? So using that as a model, when we bring it down to the level of the church, right, based on Matthew 13, you have the movement and you have Adventists. The same principle applies if we're going to be governed by the lines in terms of how we view our current dispensation. There is no salvation for Adventists outside of this movement, right? And the implications of this are when you start reasoning out the implications of this in terms of what that looks like in practical life, it becomes very solemn. It becomes a hard saying. It becomes something very difficult to receive, to internalize. So I have in my notes here, right. So the model works for the Nethinim the same way it does for the Levites. The plants in the parable, you have wheat and tares, but the plants in the parable, the people represented by the plants are also the people represented by the servants that do the work of harvesting. Right. So as an individual, you can have more than one symbol in this parable applying to you, at a given point in time, depending on what is being looked at. If you are a Levite, according to the parable, you need someone to reap you, right? The harvest was reaped by the servants. You need someone to reap you. You cannot reap yourself or be saved in a private fashion, just between you and God. Just like here, the church is giving a message. It's giving a third angel. It's giving the third angel's message in the context of the Sunday law crisis. The people in the world are not saving themselves. They save themselves by receiving this truth and thereby becoming part of this body. So you cannot be saved in a private fashion between you and God. If it's true at this level, so it is necessarily true at this level also. The householder says, if you want to come into my barn, this is the illustration Elder Parminda gave. He says, if you want to come into my barn, you have to come in through one of the workers. One of the workers has to reap you, right? That is foundational to the gospel, right? The idea that we are God's instruments for the salvation of other people. Right? So the text says, I don't trust the reaper, I trust you, God. And the householder whose God says, well, that's not how I work, right? So the challenge is, right? So the modeling is clear. And again, time and time again, what has challenged, where people fall off is when they stop allowing their thinking and perspective to be governed by the parables, right? So the model is clear, but what we see when we observe the Adventist church, we see a field that is decimated, right? We see a field that is filled with tares and maybe just the odd wheat here and there. And it then presents the challenge, really, you're then confronted with the fact of, so is it really so few people that are going to be saved, right? Out of the Levites, and by extension, out of the world. Is it really so few people that are going to come out of the, essentially, step out from being a tare and, become a wheat? That is the challenge that is presented. And that thought, it then becomes, it's a hard pill to swallow, right? Well, one thing, it highlights the importance that we are the reapers, right? Our agency in the salvation of the Levites is crucial. It's as crucial as it has always been, right? They are not saved without us, and they're not teaching themselves either, because we didn't teach ourselves. We didn't teach ourselves Daniel 11:45. We didn't teach ourselves the prophetic lines, which show us where we presently stand. We didn't teach ourselves the Eden to Eden model. We didn't teach ourselves the 25-20. We didn't teach ourselves any of these things, right? At some point, a teacher stood before us and taught us. And it's the same thing for the Levites. So we cannot come to a place, at least not without imperiling their salvation and therefore imperiling our own salvation. We cannot come to a place where we take the perspective that we absolve ourselves of responsibility and say, God will deal with the Levites. They will go sort themselves out. We are the ones who are meant to deal with the Levites, right? So I think that's an important point.
Oh, could
Yes?
may I ask for just a little bit of clarification with your model on the whiteboard, please?
Okay.
Wheat tares at the top level world. Church outside the church. Would it be church as in the broadest sense of Christian church? Like, in other words, the largest body that have taken on the name of Christ versus worldlings who want nothing to do with Christ. Is that the sense of church? Because the reason I'm asking that, down to the next level, movement versus Adventist, wheat and tares, and then down to the third level, the smallest level. Wheat and tares are both indistinguishable on the side of the wheat because it's all priests. So who becomes, like, is there anything on the other side, you know, at that movement level? Is there anything else on the other side under what you've got above tares, or is it the tares have moved over just amongst the one group and it's the group of priests, those that are in the movement today as priests, and therefore the wheat and tares only come out of that? So I guess there's two questions there. Top level church, what is being designated by that word church? And the second question would be at the micro level, at the smallest level of the movement, there are only tares as a part in the movement. Like there's no other tares outside the movement at that smallest level. We're just talking in the movement, priests in the movement, and they have a group that are wheat and a group that are tares. I don't know if
Okay,
that's
I'll speak to your second question first, and I invite anyone else to interject if you have a thought. Well, basically at this level, there isn't another group outside of the priests. You have both wheat and tares within the movement, right? At this level in the parable. I'd have to think about how I would further develop that answer, but that's how I understand it, right? And when it comes to this level, it's not dealing with the church, the Christian church versus those outside the Christian church, because at this level, if we look at other lines of truth, the Christian church has become a part of Babylon. The Christian church has essentially become part of this group outside the church. So when we're speaking the church here, we're speaking of the group of people that are giving the third angel's message, right? So here, church, we can put /SDA, but then the problem is we know that at this level it won't be the corporate Seventh-day Adventist church, right? But that's the church, the group of people that are giving the third angel. And those outside the church is essentially everyone else in the world, including all of Christendom, right?
and that's the way I understood it. I just, in a sense, was questioning the use of that word church without spelling it out more, because I agree 100% with what you said. It would be more, to me, like it's the kingdom of God, because you were using the seal of God versus not receiving the seal of God. And the seal of God, we know, is not being placed on the Seventh-day Adventist church members just simply because they're Adventists. But so three angels message that.
I'll just put that if I'm open to someone else as a better way of putting that, but yeah, so that's those are my thoughts in connection with that.
Chavo.
Yes.
Where do we come to the fact that there's actually two groups, like church versus outside the church? What is there a part of the parable that specifically highlights that? I'll tell you why I ask, just because the model, like, it would be very convenient, and I'm not saying this is right, but it'd be very convenient to say, okay, well, the world is the world, and there's going to be people out, in the world that are saved and people in the world that are lost. Just say I wanted to reference the quote saying, oh, there'll be those in heaven that never knew the name Jesus or whatever, right? Okay. And then in the church, it would be very convenient to say, okay, there's those in the church that'll be lost and saved, wheat, tares in the church. And then it would be the very same model for the movement, where there'll be priests that are lost and priests that are saved, sort of a thing. So you would have a very congruent model where they were all the same. I'm not saying that's correct. I'm just asking if in the parable that there's a specific key that gives us the two, like there's a specific group to be inside versus outside in the model.
Well, the parable, when you look at it at this macro level application, where it's dealing with, it only presents two classes, right? And it's presenting the only two types of crop in the field, right? And we also have to remember that it is dealing with corporate level, not individual level. So, the fact that there are people who may physically be in the church, but they've not internalized the truth and they're going to be lost and so on. That's an individual level consideration. The parable is not dealing with that. Hello?
Something happened to your camera, Tabo. We can't see you.
Okay. It's discharged. Okay, sorry, hold on for a second.
So what I'm hearing you say, just while you're dealing with the camera, is that the way I was looking at it was jumping back and forth between corporate and individual, versus you're showing the model as a corporate model.
Yes, I'll have to switch to my, I don't know, my phone hasn't discharged. It's just giving an error message. Maybe it's overheated. So let me switch to my, okay. So basically, yes, yeah, this is dealing with, it's not, the parable is not bringing to view that, those dynamics at the individual level. It's dealing with, as a corporate body, those outside of the church are lost, right? And the same dynamic then comes down to the church, that the Levites as a class, they are lost, but that's at a corporate level. But at the individual level, we know that the Levites, because the Levites represent Adventists, both wheat and tares, right?
Tabo,
And-
can you move your laptop camera just a little over to catch the, yes,
Okay.
thank you.
Sorry.
Oh, that's good.
Right, but we know that individual Levites will step out from here and move over to this side. And that is to happen through us, through our agency as the servants who do the work of harvesting.
So in a sense, that same would carry through at every one of the levels, in that there will be individuals at the top level that are outside the church. A few individuals may find their way into the three angels' messages body, as well as SDAs, the Levites, which are the SDAs, but a few will find their way into the movement.
Just as the people need to come out of here and step here, they need to come out of here and step here, right? And just as there is a people who are the agents of calling these people to do that work of stepping out of here to step here, it's the same at this level. So he was emphasizing the point that it's not that Levites cannot be saved at all. That's not what is being said. But the prophetic model teaches that they cannot be saved without us. Salvation is not a DIY venture. Right? Our understanding of the harvest is correct. And what we have misunderstood, and use the term that because we have delusions of grandeur, we've had these grand ideas about what the work we're going to do looks like. What we've misunderstood is that we thought there would be a massive ingathering, but it will not be the numbers we were thinking. So following from that, people struggle with the fact that so few will be saved at the end of the world, right? Because when we take this model and apply it to the reality that we see in the church, we see, wow, and how few we are as priests. We say, wow, you know, so few are going to be saved in the world. But if we can internalize this reality, it's a bitter pill to swallow, but if we can internalize this reality, then we would be more like, use the examples of Noah and Elijah, right? Noah and Elijah put forth every effort for the salvation of the people in their respective dispensations. And we look at both their cases, what did they achieve? You know, Noah's enterprise, Noah saved himself and you know, barely saved his household, but Noah's enterprise, apart from saving himself, was a failed enterprise. None of them of that generation were saved, right? But there is also the fact that, but if Noah had not followed every step that God had required of him, and if Noah had not done the work done the very work that God had told him to do, notwithstanding the poor result, he would not have been saved himself. So that becomes an important thought, that really the primary purpose of this movement and the work that this movement is required to do, it's to save us. We are saved by it. But, you know, once your salvation has been secured, and at this point it isn't, there's still, no one's salvation is secure at this point. You can still fall away, and there are people still falling away, and there are people, you know, still trying to get it together in different ways, whatever the case may be. But once you receive this truth, it's your job to get trained up, you know, to exercise and become fit spiritually to do the work of going to the world and teaching, right? Going to the Levites and teaching. The two streams are not going to harvest them, right? Independent of us, we do that work. Right? And again, when you see how few we are versus the side, it becomes daunting that, wow, so so few people. Ultimately, the harvest it's not a grand, it's quite meager in terms of literal numbers relative to our former thinking of what it looked like. And he makes the point that, you know, that the challenge is people have not come to the point of, or they are avoiding coming to the point of feeling the pain at the thought of the futility of anything and everything we do, right? The futility and meagerness of all our effort in connection with this enterprise, in contrast with the grand scheme of things, with all that is happening in the world, you know, the amount of impact that we're able to have as individuals and as a movement is comparatively minuscule. And that is the reality of the great controversy. And that's the thought that it's an important thought to internalize. You know, it's an important thought to internalize, because then next to it, you then realize that my agency, my role, my seriousness with my spirituality, and how seriously I take this message, and how seriously I take my responsibility to share it, that will weigh on you a lot more. And as human beings, we don't like burdens, generally speaking. We try to excuse ourselves. But we cannot excuse ourselves from this without jeopardizing other people's salvation and forfeiting our own. That's the reality. Yeah, you were saying, when you look at the returns, it looks like a complete waste of time. Noah, complete waste of time. Elijah, you know, virtually a complete waste of time. But the work had to be done to the T. Every step needed to be followed for their own salvation. Do you have any thoughts? I had a thought, but it's escaped my mind. All right, someone's raised their hand. Jonathan, yes, please.
So when we look at like why these numbers are going to be so small, I mean, maybe it's the number of different reasons, but is it because of the failure of us? Like leading up to Daniel 11:41, with the many being overthrown within this movement, it kind of shows that if the numbers are small now, if we think they're small now, they're going to be even smaller in the future. There's something going on with us. There's wheat and tares in the movement. And if people in the world and in the SDA church need us to be we need to reap them, and our numbers keep getting smaller. Is it our fault? Like, is it the failure of us? It's not the failure of the corporate movement, but is it the failure of the individuals because we, you know, for whatever reason, like you just spoke about, take it serious, you know, our mission. And it seems like a lot of people have been struggling. And almost like there's almost that sense of what a shaking is like, probably on the individual level. Like everyone's probably thinking, am I going to be here, you know, like in a couple of years, the same way we probably have been feeling for a long time. But is it because of that? Is it because of the individuals in the movement that these people will be lost? Or is it because of their decision? They just don't like the people in the SDA church. They just don't like the reality of God's kingdom when they're confronted with it, or when it's presented to them. Or is it a combination of those things? Yeah,
lots of parts there. I'll try to speak to it and invite anyone else to add. Well, I think as Elder Parminter said, that it's not for a negative reason that you know, there isn't a massive ingathering, a massive harvest, because you know, we have to try to avoid chalking up, I guess, dynamics that are playing out at the corporate level and looking at individual causes. I don't know, I'm thinking this out as I'm saying it. but I think maybe the answer to your question lies in part in the fact that, distinguishing between corporate and individual. And it's not for a negative reason that the harvest looks the way that it does. This movement is a movement of success, so it will succeed. But ultimately, what that success, we've conflated that success looking like many people being saved, and maybe many people will be saved from another perspective, but relative to the number of people in the world and in the Adventist church, it's a minuscule number of people that are going to be saved. But this movement at a corporate level is still a movement of success. So yeah, there's a lot to wrap one's mind around there. At the individual level, people make decisions, people make decisions to prioritize and engage, right? To try to make this message and the truth the guiding influence of their lives. Some people leave for various reasons, and that's going to keep happening, right? Some priests are leaving. Some are being replaced by Levites, right? That are joining the movement, right? They are people coming into the movement now. They are, right? Like I went to when I was in South Africa, there were people there who came out of the Adventist church straight into this movement. So that is happening. That exchange of people leaving and new people coming in, that's going to keep happening, right? But ultimately, this is a movement of success. But we must reconcile the juxtaposition, reconcile the contradiction, I should say, the apparent contradiction of the fact that this is a movement of success, but that success does not look like what we consider success to look like. It does not look bountiful, right? And I probably haven't answered your question, but I don't know if I have. I don't know if I can answer your question, but those are my thoughts in response to what you shared. Does anyone want to speak to what to what Jonathan said?
Two thoughts came to mind, and one of them was, I'll just use the word responsibility. There are two examples that came to my mind. One is David's prayer of repentance, Psalm 51, verses 10 through 13. Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me. Goes on, cast me not away, restore unto me the joy of thy salvation. And in verse 13, then, it's an added word, but it does clarify, then will I teach transgressors thy ways, and sinners shall be converted unto thee. We had a responsibility as Seventh-day Adventists, but the responsibility as priests in this movement is even greater. Others' salvation depends on us. And that's, it's a concept that intellectually we probably accept it a little bit, even as a Seventh-day Adventist. This concept of we've got the truth, not in an arrogant way, as sometimes gets lived, but more just as in a humble way. But as the movement has progressed, we have now realized that in essence, to just put it baldly, no one else will be saved except coming through this movement. It's the representative of Christ on this earth, the true kingdom of God. The second example that came to my mind was Abraham in Genesis 18. Some use the word bargaining with God, but I'll use the word pleading with God. If there were 50 righteous people, all the way down to peradventure, if there are 10 righteous people, and Abraham leaving off there at that point because he feels for sure there are 10 righteous people left. And here it turns out, no. The cities of the plain, all 5 of them, were destroyed. And Lot and his 2 children were saved out of that. So the parables run true, but at the same time, intellectually, we can accept some of these things. But when it gets down to the actuality of the likelihood of how few are going to be saved, 8 went on the ark. And the responsibility that part of it, but also the responsibility that each one of us plays in that and in our spheres of influence. It becomes a very solemn, serious understanding, and that we each have to, in a sense, grapple with and wrap our minds around and recognize for ourselves.
Yeah, as you close, Aldapaminda made a point, which I was like, yes, but that's true. That when you read in his first presentation, he highlighted the point that because we've been so, he used the term heavenly minded, so biblically minded, we have not allowed the secular political reality to balance our perception of how we view the world and how we view situations, right? So the result is, because our perspective has been narrowed through a strict sort of only scriptural mindset, it's true, it's correct, but because it is narrow, it can then lead to errors and misunderstandings and so on and so forth, right? Then he pointed out like 1844. We believe 1844 on a spiritual level, but we don't have oversight. We understand the spiritual significance of 1844, but before the Midnight Cry, we didn't really have oversight over its political significance, that it was a transformative year for the United States. And the things that happened that year on a political level, sort of reverberate to the present, right? And it's the lack of a holistic worldview, right, that considers both religious and political, that we make mistakes, right? So he then pointed out, he spoke about Paul, that firstly with Paul, God, it was the same in that time period. God did not send angels to speak to the Gentiles. He trained up Saul and allowed him to commit all manner of havoc and mayhem, as part of his training, because God knew that without this person, no one's going to reach the Gentiles, right? And then Saul becomes Paul. And when you read the Bible, again, if you're going to take because our perspective tends to be narrowly scriptural, you read the book of Acts, it sounds like Paul shook the entire world, right? And if you read Spirit of Prophecy, we tend to present it that way, that Paul shook the entire world. But he didn't, really. If you look at it on a grand scheme of things, you know, Paul's impact on the world, right, it was minuscule, given the teeming millions that existed in the world and even in that region of the world. Paul's impact was quite minuscule, but the impact that he had on the people that he did reach was transformative, right? And it's the same dynamic, I think, that is playing out with us. Really, you know, we're not going to be, yeah, I'll just put it that way. It's the same dynamic. Playing out with us at the end of the world. It kind of looks the same in that way. But the centrality, or rather, you know, the significance of the importance of Paul in terms of the work that he did should give us pause to think about our importance, right? And our importance and responsibility in the work of harvesting, in the work of reaching any Levites that are going to be saved, and after that, the world. Okay. Jonathan shared a passage. He says, this passage comes to mind. There are many who could have been saved had there been more workers doing the work of harvest. Matthew 9:37. Then saith he unto his disciples, the harvest truly is plenteous, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. This passage hits with a new significance in light of the information that that's been presented to us. Do I have any more questions or points before I close the prayer?
Yeah, I have a comment.
Yes.
And my comment is with regards to our Adventist churches. Anyway, it's just on the same topic. So some of us, we attend church, our children go there, they're pathfinders, they're adventurers. We've been in those churches for 10 years, almost 15 years. Anyways, over, I'm saying. And the impression or the influence that we've had in the church has weighted those. We've been attacked, we've shied off from presenting, from sharing, from it just, anyway, there's that essence of being burnt out as well. So after going for so long, trying to do the same thing over and over, no change. And where we are is maybe burnt out, depressed, frustrated, and, annoyed, the trying company, or just trying to reel things in to see how far out we are in the ocean, or still like trying to understand the role that we ought to play. Like, how do we come in? We've been shunned because at some point we were saying that Trump is the last president, and teaching and pushing, and then Trump is not the last president, and everybody questions what you were saying and asks you also Trump, and you have not started explaining that it's not Trump, it's Trumpism. Mm-hmm. And anyway, up to the point that we are, the message that Paminda is sharing, for me, it's like, I think he is spot on when he is saying, like our focus is not that the Levites, they're coming, or how many, when are they coming, or whatever. And he's pointing us to the time of Noah, And in the time of Noah, the point that Elder Tabo shared, that that they were going to be saved by following every instruction that was given, every step of the way. And even Noah for himself, for him to be saved on the ark, he had to heed to every instruction. The wood has to be discarded this size. Like the pillars have to be put like this. Like the nails have to go here at a certain time. The angle of the roof has to be like this. The tar, this much tar, this amount. It has to be exact, following the steps. And even for us right now, we understand that those steps, the steps of truth, like how truth is built, how to, like we as it were have been given the whole picture. We have the whole idea. We can write a book and say from A to Z, but now how do we present it? And when we come to that point of how do we present it, right? There is so much that is being asked of us in terms of, are we following those steps? Because some of us, as I said, we are depressed, we are angered, we are frustrated, we are this or this, and we've lost sight. We've even lost sight of the health message. You have to drink lots of water. We have to not stress. We have to godly trust. We have to follow all those laws of health, as simple as that, right? And other things and other steps along the way. So I don't know if God is calling forth laborers, which is what we're supposed to be doing, that there is a work for us to play in getting the Levites, and it is on, like, the salvation of many is dependent on us. That should break us down to even follow those steps, ensure that we are, from the moment we wake up, from the time we go to sleep, we are, and following these steps, of course, is how are we understanding the lines? How are we understanding the books? How do we respond to this? How do we learn this? Like, okay, we have to go like that. I find that's what it's happening to me, because now I'm going back and developing those studies for myself and how to present it and writing it down. Even if it's an old study, it's an old truth that we understood, and it was a building block leading us where we are right now, because it will be asked of us at some point where we're going in terms of the laboring and the sharing. So that's what I wanted to share. So yeah, so that's what I was saying. Paminda is spot on, because now we don't have to look at the Levites. Now we have to look at ourselves, right? And are we laboring in the lines, to understand the line, to understand how to present, to pray and to honest and to push, because their work, God is doing it already. Okay, that's it. Sorry I took too long.
If we aren't moved by the thought of, our loved ones, our family members, and those in the church, the souls of those in the church, if we aren't moved by them to become focused, about the message and understanding it, studying it, learning to share it effectively, knowing it. If we aren't moved by those other considerations, we should at the very least be moved by base self-preservation, that our salvation as priests depends upon it as well. Okay, so our time, I'll ask that we close with a word of prayer, and then we'll have a closing hymn from Douglas. Let's pray. Lord in heaven, we thank you for your word. We thank you, Lord, that whenever questions arise, whenever our feet imperceptibly or start to wander from the path, you point us back to the path. You point us back to the lines. You point us back to parables. You point us back to the midnight cry. And we see, Lord, that the path is narrow, and a grave responsibility rests on us as priests for ourselves and for your people, whether they be Levites or Nephilim. Help us to play our part. that the best can be done from the circumstances. The best can be done of what is possible with divine aid, with divinity combining with humanity to work for the salvation of other people. Help us to feel the weight of our responsibility, and not just to carry it as a burden, but may it move us to action, action for ourselves, and action ultimately for other people. Please bless us for the remainder of the Sabbath, for we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.